Hi everyone. That was a very, very practical talk that we had just now. Mine is going to be a little bit more on the conceptual side. I do think though that the three talks that the two that you have heard and the one you will hear now, I think sort of build up on each other quite nicely. So I do hope that you will be able to interpret all of the things that you heard through your own prisms and your own teams and your own companies and your own products and essentially be able to take some learnings with you home tonight. So let's get to business. My name is Plamena, as you already heard. I work at a Berlin-based startup called Blinkist. Anyone heard of Blinkist? No, that's okay. Yeah, okay. I think it's actually probably better if you haven't, for the sake of the example that I'm going to show. So for the past collectively maybe 3 years, I've worked in support and documentation, and I sort of really appreciate the opportunity that this role is giving me to really sit back and like reflect on my writing before I release it into the whole wide world, to being in the form of a customer email or a documentation article. And my goal here tonight, considering I'm not a developer, so that's my disclaimer. I'm not a developer. My academic background is in communications and sociology. So I guess you could say my mind is triggered by concepts. But in my job, I work with developers. And I work with the people, developers and customer support specialists essentially work for, the users. So this is me. And I consider myself in that role sort of a mediator. And I think, contrary to my decision to include this GIF, I actually take this role very, very seriously. Because I think that documentation or like documentarians as mediators, sort of like interpreters, if you will, sort of have this job where they always know more than they share. But their job is to share the most essential parts of the information that is relevant to each stakeholder and to help them make the best of it at any given moment. In my talk, therefore, I will try to connect my love for concepts with my firsthand experience of talking to users, of listening to them, in an attempt to explain or present to you my vision about the benefits and the challenges of applying empathy to documentation. Before we dive into it, I think there's this one question that we would have to answer, or I would have to answer, and that is, why is good documentation important? Now, I think you might be on the side where you kind of have your own definition or your own answer to this question, or if you're in the other extreme, it's possible that you haven't really thought about it before because you've been busy doing your actual work. So I'm going to present to you my vision or version, but feel free to approach me afterwards. Let me know your perspective, because I'm very curious about finding out how other people perceive this. So something I see often when talking to developers or working with them is a mindset that is very goal-oriented. So that mindset can be like phrased a bit differently depending on the environment or the company, but it's always something along the lines of create a flawless product. So a flawless product in this sense means create a product that has all the functionalities that function flawlessly. This is the immediate goal. And don't get me wrong, I don't think this is wrong. On the contrary, this is, after all, I would say the purpose of product development teams to begin with. But have you ever worked on a project or been at a team where the product that you were coming up with or the feature was like pure genius, and like the release was on time and everybody on the team was super happy with it, and they just kind of didn't catch on, like the users just like didn't get it or weren't interested in it whatsoever, no matter what the marketing team did to like pump up the release and everything. If you have been there in one way or another, I hope you might be able to relate to what I'm going to say. So coming back to my role as a support specialist, my premise as a person working with users every day is simple, and that is that it's actually not enough to create a flawless product in the sense with purely the functionalities working if your users don't know what to do with it. This is, I think, especially true for companies that produce services that are supposed to make users' lives easier, so like professional lives easier. We're talking marketing automation, any kind of automation technologies, online marketing. In the past, what often used to be the case was that developers were often producing for other developers. So what used to be the case, it of course still exists now, is that much explanation of what the product was or how it would add value to the customer, client, project, or company as a whole wasn't really necessary. Today, however, software as a service companies increasingly, or more often than not, have to face the challenge of where they have to sell their product to non-tech people. So these non-tech people can be communication specialists, community managers, you name it, depending on the industry. But these people happen to have the authority or the decision-making power to essentially decide whether your product is worth their money and their time. And in order for you to convince them that this is the case, you would have to explain your product. So depending on how your product is organized, you might call this explaining documentation, education, user manuals even. But no matter what you call it, we come to the point where this explaining or making sure that your users know what your product is and how it works is crucial to acquisition, to retention, and then ultimately to growth, to the growth of your entire company or your product. Then we also come to the point where in order to measure the success of a product, besides the flawlessness, so besides the working functionalities that we built, or you built, we have to make sure that we have to look at the value that this product ends up actually bringing to the users. And that value is generated beyond the sales pitch and beyond the purchase or subscription or whatever the payment method is. And it's generated in long-term interactions with your product. So therefore, I hope you would agree with me, documentation is not just a nice to have in this sense, but it's part of your product. And this sort of builds up upon, builds up upon what Peter said, where if you have a product approach to documentation and a product approach to education, this is wonderful, but not all companies are like that. I would bet very few of them are at this stage. So having established that, the documentation is part of your product. How do you make sure, or how do we make sure that our documentation is not just good, but it's great? So like, how do we make sure that it helps us build a sustainable relationship with our customers? And I think the challenge here that technical writers face is something that requires experience to get right, and that is empathy. So not only tech writers face this challenge, I think developers do as well. Because even though I think the will or the openness to really talk to your users or get into your users' shoes, sort of make this mindset change is very much there, finding the actual time to like talk to users or do any form of user research, for that matter, is much more difficult in practice than it is in theory. And to give you some kind of a hypothetical example, I think maybe you can also relate to this. When you have these ideas about how your tests can go, and you have your hypotheses and your surveys and your questionnaires and your hopes and dreams, and you have them out there, and you have your team, and you ship all of these, but then there are many lightnings that sort of strike on your success. So there are multiple stakeholders, often multiple decision makers in your team, in your company, also from other teams. There are external deadlines coming in, there are requests from other teams, and more often than not, I would argue, in my experience, if that's not yours, then that's really great, you're lucky. The time resource that is required to actually spend talking to users or doing any form of user research, more often than not, ends up being allocated elsewhere. I understand this challenge, and I have struggled with it in startups of different sizes. So I'm here today to tell you that while applying empathy to documentation is an effort that requires a lot of time and energy, the benefits of it are considerable. And even if you don't have a dedicated task force on your team, a user research task force in your documentation team, this sounds like exotic to say, I guess. There are things you can do in your everyday work, or you can start doing, that would ultimately lead to your documentation being more empathetic. So let's start simple. If we can agree that empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, we transfer this to our context, and if we think of documentation as sort of our way to transfer the necessary amount of knowledge about a product to our users, the first thing we have to consider, and I feel is often overlooked or is thought to be self-explanatory in many teams, is this kind of situation. So when interacting with our documentation, this is, so like the twist dancing is us thinking that we've done our best, it's amazing, it's great, and then our users are kind of just trying to navigate the situation, figure out WTH is happening. So my point with the slide is essentially that our users will always, in all of the cases possible, know less than we do about our product. And this may seem sort of, why are you even explaining this? Of course, it's the case. But this is ultimately where we have to empathize with them. And this means, above all, to me, that we have to be ready to actively listen to them. And in that process of active listening, ignore the urge that is very often there for all of us to make assumptions about how our users are interacting with our product, what they're seeing, when they're facing an issue, what they're seeing, and so on and so forth. Somebody's making a photo of the slide. It's nice. So first part of the success equation for me is listening. So listening is important. It may be done by the customer support team at your company, if you're lucky enough to have a designated customer support team, if you're at the right size for that. But even if that's the case, the attitude towards active listening, the idea that the customer experience or the user's experience is central to the whole team defining the success of a product, has to be adopted by everybody who is involved in a product development, not only support people, success managers, and so on. Let me give you an example here. So at Blinkist, what we do is we deliver bite-sized summaries of nonfiction books, and we do that in written and audio form. Audios are about 15 minutes long, and we record the audio versions using real people. So the entire process is human-based. And from a developer's perspective, I guess you can say that the product is an app with a very strong focus on the audio player. Sometime last year, we started receiving requests or emails from users asking whether we have started using AI or machines, they called it, to record our audio versions, because they were all sped up and blurry and weird, and how dare we compromise the quality of our product by saving money on actual voice artists and using sped up robot voices. So having worked in this company for 2 years, I know we don't do this now, we didn't do it back then, so that can't really be the thing. So how would you address this issue? It must be something wrong with the app. I would check what I did, I checked the audio version. Ideally, you would do it on multiple devices. The audio version is fine, so then you start troubleshooting what the user, or me as a support person, does. So delete and reinstall. Everything works fine for a day or two, and then it's back to the same suboptimal audio experience. So moving on, you can now get a developer on board, or at least in our company, to investigate and find nothing, because there's nothing wrong with the product. So in this sort of turn of events, I like to also spend a minute to talk about something that I call the bug not bug mentality. And I think this is a focus that developers and customer support people and QA people share, that there's this either bug or not bug outcome of the situation. So either it's a bug and we have to get a developer on board and there's something that they can do to fix it, or it's not a bug and there really isn't much reason for both teams to interact with each other. So like, why? So as you can probably imagine by now, or I teased this sort of, the problem in my example wasn't a bug. The developers had done their job perfectly prior to the release. But what everyone did, and myself included, is that we assumed what the users were seeing in the app, or how they were interacting with it. And at some point in this like resolution process, I had an idea. What if, it's quite simple really, what if every single person that reported this to us tapped on the audio speed up button at some point in their player and then just didn't realize it? And that was a bit against statistics at the time, considering the amount of people that reported this, but they did. Every one of them did, and they didn't realize it, every single one of them. And neither did we, because we were focused on finding out what's wrong with the product. Where's the bug? Where is it? And sort of what this thing kind of showed us is the importance of making assumptions at the right point, the importance of making the right assumptions. So what assumptions essentially help us do is they help reduce the burden of uncertainty, right? So assumptions are good. We are often inclined or required to make them, also in our product development efforts. But I would argue, I mean, after all, what I did in this case was to make an assumption that they tapped on the audio speed up button. But in order to be able to get to the helpful kind of assumptions, I would argue, we have to devote a large portion of our resources and our attention to empathy first. And empathy, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, for me, starts with active listening. And active listening is something that I think can be ensured or enabled in your company or your team by setting up 3, for now, major structures or processes, whatever you call them. Now, you may have them in your company already. They may be sort of obsolete as an explanation to you, but then there may be other people who might benefit from them. So the first one is monitoring. You would have to monitor all the customer issues, complaints. This basically means monitor all the communication channels that your company operates. This is usually done, or also at Blinkist, by the customer support team. However, in many small startups, also in startups I've worked before, developers were very closely involved in actually doing support. So monitoring here is always, to me, the key to long-term success. The second process is or structure is you have to enable a two-way reporting process between developers, support team, technical writers, if you're fortunate enough to have those 3 designated task forces established in your teams. And that process has to be two-way because on the one hand, features have to be reported to the customer-facing side, new features, updates, etc. And then on the other side, customer-facing teams report any kind of issues, problems, or unclarities about UX, for example, that might influence future product development decisions. The third one is, I would call it a shared backlog of kind of solved cases that you can establish between all the 3 teams. This means that support people would also see cases that developers worked on where they weren't necessarily involved. Why? Because first of all, it ensures transparency, and then second of all, or my bottom line with this is that the more cases you're familiar with, even indirectly, of course better directly, but still, the faster your mind will work in the future when faced with a new unknown situation or uncertain situation. And if, in case you're wondering what this has to do with active listening, because I was asked this question before, I think a very central part to my understanding of empathy is that empathy is not only user-directed, user-oriented or customer-oriented. Empathy can also be oriented towards our team, towards fellow teams, and having this opportunity to sort of check on each other's progress and in the form of a backlog ensures that we also listen to each other, even though it may not be in this sort of literal sense. So what we ended up doing in the end with our example with the speed up button is we put together the necessary documentation for this use case. And then of course we took this feedback and included it in our future decision-making process about any kind of improvements that were to be made to the audio player. I know that's a very small example, but I think it illustrates the point very well, because when putting together our documentation on the audio player, we assumed we had covered all the use cases, right? We had explained, after all, how to use the speed up button. However, in this explanation, we also assumed that this speed up function would only be activated deliberately by the user. And what sort of active listening helped us do is find out that it can also go the other way around. And this way we were able to update our documentation, include this, and then also sort of ensure that future users would have the help that they need immediately when finding themselves in a similar situation. I realize this is also like super good relationship advice now, but it's like, that's not on my script. So okay, conclusion, right? Conclusion, being reactive to such user stories and working with our developers towards the ultimate, for myself, goal of having happy users that are happy with our product has taught me that documentation is not just about putting on paper what you know. It's like a metaphor. We don't actually put it on paper, but you know. So coming back to my analogy from the beginning with the interpreters, I think documentation is also in a way similar to interpretation, because it requires you to really filter all the information in your head, all the knowledge that you have about your product, and really sort of distribute only the necessary pieces of information that are relevant to the user, which also goes back to Peter's don't explain things that the users know, focus on the gaps, display only the information that is relevant for this particular moment where the user is interacting with your product, for this particular page, for this particular screen, or whatever, you name it. And that process requires, I would argue, our full attention, our empathy, and our creative thinking just as much as our product development efforts do. So in the words of Samuel Jackson, empathy goes a long way. Can anybody guess the original quote? No? Okay, I was gonna figure out some like chocolate price. It's personality, but empathy for the sake of my talk. Empathy can go a long way, and while it may be difficult to see the sort of the immediate benefits of applying empathy to documentation, to your documentation, my personal experience has taught me that adopting these basic techniques helped me ultimately better explain our product, increase our user satisfaction rate, and what active listening also does for you and your company is it ensures that you don't miss out on any valuable feedback that could inform future product development decisions in your further quest for the flawless product. So in my opinion, a flawless product is a product that solves the defined problem of a large enough target group. So if you have a flawless product already, don't just let that flawlessness kind of like shape, you know, well, how did I formulate it? Don't just let that remain in the shadows. I'm sorry. That was like my closing line. Never mind. Remain in the shadows when you can document it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Plamena. Do we have any question? Any question for Plamena? Anyone? Don't be shy. All right, so I have a question.
Oh.
So I would like to know about that speed up button.
Mm-hmm.
What was the final resolution? Like, did you change something in the UI? How did you improve it?
Yeah. So for me as a stakeholder, we were able to change the add this sort of to our documentation, but I said this was included in our decision-making process because right now there's major revampings of the player, so we weren't able to implement this like today we're going to work on this. As you also know, products have roadmaps, so it's not really possible for us to like iterate to this point, but it was included in our future decision-making processes, and then the new player that they're working on right now is going to have sort of implications that are influenced by this feedback. Yeah.
Cool.
So I can't show you like the new player, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to. All right, thanks. Any other question that you may have think of? All right.
Oh, me.
It's mine.
So how does this work in your company in terms of the empathy? Have you found that there were some developers or product managers, I guess those would be the two focuses, who actually are taking this into account? Do you feel like this message is, are you able to get this message out there, this active listening and this empathy? Feel like you've made some changes to the company on that, or the company is becoming more and more empathetic?
Yeah, I feel we are, but this is also, I have to say that the topic that I'm talking about is also inspired sort of by the company, because we also have a very empathetic culture in terms of the people type of culture. So this kind of broader perspective of empathy sort of got to me and made me think about applying it to my job. So I would say yes, definitely, but it's a change that was sort of, I mean, it's a change, it's a transition, it's a shift in perspective that was definitely driven by this overall empathy as a value kind of idea for the whole team. Yeah.
One final question. Sylvain.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering how you make sure the usage of your documentation. Do you have a way to track how it is used?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some tools in terms of tooling? What are you using?
Yeah, it seems to be like a very yeah. Well, we do. We have basic tracking on the website, so we have like a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing. First of all, we have views. But then we also have the feedback form that you talked about. We also have it, and it's usually something that people kind of find and use for a different problem that's not related to the article. So we sometimes we would see which article they came from, but they weren't really referring to that. We don't do, as far as I know, like any super advanced analytics in this case, because we are also very much. I mean, I don't know if I can say we are a B2C company as opposed to Algolia, because Algolia can also be a B2C. But we are focused on end users using an app for self-development. So it's a different kind of product in this sense. So documentation is also used differently. But yeah, I personally don't really think thumbs ups and downs are very valuable, because it's often, sometimes someone is just having a bad day or they're frustrated. So I don't really consider this the most valuable source.
Thank you. And just one last question, also regarding the way people interact with your documentation. Do you have, like, for example, the search? Is it something you are tracking, the way it's used, if there is no result, if people don't find what they're looking for?
Yeah, we do. We track search on the Help Center, and we have like a monthly meeting where we discuss, so what was like especially searched on, can we maybe improve those articles, can we maybe improve some processes, so we use that to inform decisions also in other teams.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Plamena.